including a major textbook in tropical forest ecology and management, and about 250 scientific articles, of which 80% have been published in internationally revered journals. She teaches and advises individual project courses in agroforestry, landscape restoration, and soil conservation and management. She also holds honorary professorships at several universities in Latin America and works as a consultant advising projects related to her expertise in tropical forestry, agroforestry, and rural development worldwide. Florencia, the floor is yours.
Yeah, there you are. Thank you so much, Mariana. Thank you, everyone, for giving me the honor of introducing the 28th Annual International Society of Tropical Foresters Conference. 28, imagine that. And I have been at our school for about 30 years, so I have followed the conference year after year with topics such as this one, very relevant to what's happening today to tropical forests worldwide. So it's a pleasure to be here today, and it's a record, 840, Mariana just told me. That's one of the few things that we have to thank in the pandemic. Everything is virtual and allows for this kind of thing. So to motivate you then on rethinking restoration and recovery, landscapes of the present and future in the tropics, you have a couple of slides from some of my own sites. On the left side, you see a tropical, subtropical forest of Misiones in Argentina. We're going to talk about that in a few more minutes, a little bit more. It's one of my major research sites. And on the right side, the Atlantic forest in Bahia, Brazil, one of the biodiversity hotspots where we're doing some ecosystem restoration. And you can see there we're planting, enriching, etc. So let's start motivating ourselves with, let me try to see this one. Look at this slide, this graphic in the slide, the most severe risks on a global scale in the next 10 years. And you see the green are the environmental, and then the red are the geopolitical, societal, technological, the blue are economic. And this was from the World Economic Forum. It was based on a major annual survey answered by major leaders of private sectors. And it was provided to me with by one of my former classmates. He's now at the World Bank. He's a global lead of forests, landscapes, and natural resources and blue economy, Garo Batmanian. So he was noting to me, he was telling me, look at the 5 of the 10 global risks are environmental. You see, they're this green color in 5 of those risks. And biodiversity loss ranks number 3. Imagine that. How did we make it go that far? So the thinking is, now that the problems are identified, we could assume that people want to address them. That's why they were identified. So our question is today and at the conference, how can we use science to address these problems, and what actions can we take for addressing these problems? So what is the role of tropical forestry in addressing all those problems that we saw in the first slide? Well, tropical forestry is facing several challenges in the 21st century. The total area of deforested and degraded tropical land is now surpassing the area of mature or relatively undisturbed forest. So tropical forestry is now confronted with the task of finding strategies to alleviate the pressure on the remaining forest and techniques to enhance forest regeneration and restore abandoned lands, with alternatives that can be attractive to local communities. So specific challenges that tropical forestry face in the 21st century include unsustainable forestry, illegal logging, overgrazing. And you see here illustrated some of the actions that you can see there: agroforestry, restoration, nursery production, and then here are what we call biodiversity islands, biodiversity resiliency islands too. These are small patches of agricultural land that was left behind after the whole area, the whole landscape was converted into monoculture, something that you can see in many places in the tropics and subtropics. So I'm going to give you a more specific example of challenges that face tropical forests today from Misiones in Argentina, one of our research sites. Look at these beautiful pictures, that tree, and then this charismatic little bird. The Iguazu National Park, maybe some of you have visited there. The park is a part of the Atlantic Forest, which, as I said, is a biodiversity hotspot. The park in Argentina, in Misiones, in the province of Misiones, you will see a map in a little bit. It has a total of 30,000 hectares, and it's in the border of Paraguay and Brazil. And it is located within 1.2 million hectares of continuous forest that remain today of the total amount of forest that was in Misiones, which was almost twice as much, but it has been degraded through human action for a long time. So look at these two rivers, beautiful rivers. On the left, there is the Paraná River that runs all the way from the Atlantic forest into the ocean, more in Buenos Aires, the capital of the country of Argentina. And this is during normal water levels. And then on the right side, you see the Iguazu River in Misiones. The Iguazu waterfalls form in the Iguazu River. And soon after, the Iguazu River drains into the Paraná at a point that's called the triple frontier, Argentina, Brazil, Paraguay. You can imagine all the socio-political things that you can study there, three frontier. And then what has happened over the years? Those are the Iguazu Falls. See how beautiful they look today with normal water levels. What's happening today is that changes in land uses, deforestation, forest degradation associated with unusual weather patterns. And you know why that is happening, but we'll explain it to you in a minute. All those things are threatening the integrity of these landscapes, and they're producing shortages in water supply, leading to decreases in river water levels, which are dramatic, and you'll see a few pictures in a few minutes. So how does the deforestation, land degradation happen over those landscapes? Look at the 4 maps on the right side. They display the forest in green, as you can see there, over 100 years, from 1900 all the way to year 2000. Over 100 years, look at how forest degradation has happened. This is Argentina. This whole green thing, this is the province of Misiones in Argentina. And you have the Atlantic forest in Paraguay and in Brazil. But then you see how over the years, look at what's left here now in year 2000, but then imagine what it is now, 20 years later. Less than 5% remains of the Mata Atlantica, as it's called locally in Brazil, the Mata Atlantica, and it's located in eastern Paraguay, southwestern Brazil, northeastern Argentina, and it's still one of the priority biodiversity hotspots. There are 30 of those, as you may know, this classic publication by Myers and collaborators. Deforestation has happened, as always, in tropical forests to give room to plantations, in this specific case of pulp trees, principal pinus and eucalypts that are totally exotic to the region, and to cash crops such as maize, yerba mate, soybeans, tobacco, and pastures. And you see here a tobacco plantation, and these are eucalypt trees. This is in Misiones in Argentina, one of the regions where we're working with the farmers, with the National University of Misiones from the University of Misiones in Argentina. We have a memorandum of understanding. Our school has had a memorandum of understanding dating more than 30 years now, and we are still active. So the signs are generally cleared. You've seen this story before in many places in the tropics worldwide. Cleared and burned to plant tobacco, in this particular case, or other cash crops. This would be the landscape. But then forest fires happen very often due to carelessness in the use of fire as a cleaning tool. It's not probably on purpose, it just happens. And then the change in land use with the elimination of the forest results in decreases in water in the soil, because the uncovered soil is not as effective in retaining water. And then all this is complicated with migration from neighboring areas of the country, from other regions, from other countries, increasing the pressure on the tropical forest. Look at this map on the left. This is from the National Weather Service of Argentina. There are some references here. This is a forecast of precipitation for the next trimester, January, February, March of 2022. And this is the prediction of dry conditions. And here, this is here. All these colors are depicted here. This is the whole map of Argentina, but you see Misiones is here, and it is in this reddish zone. So they are predicting really severe droughts. But the forest, this is the natural forest. In a normal situation, this is a beautiful forest. Look at this forest is the Guarani Reserve at the school in Misiones manages this forest, and it's a reserve actually that belongs to a green corridor that is more than 250,000 hectares total, and it is Manan the Biosphere UNESCO reserve, and there are all kinds of, you can imagine this forest, all kinds of land uses and things that happen here. But this is the forest and its prime stage, or as prime as we can have it. The forest in the normal situation will be able to absorb the water from the soil, from deep layers, and recycle water and nutrients. That's what's happening. But look at what happens. This is the same map, but now it's talking about the temperatures. Look at the temperatures here in this. This is very red, as you can see. And again, this is the National Meteorological Service of Argentina. So what's happening here? And Beatriz Eibel, who is our main collaborator from the National University of Misiones, she's telling us, interpreting these maps, that what we can see is that large pockets of hot air form in the land. Then they generate large, high regional temperatures, extreme water shortages. And the thing is that these events, although they were rare in the past, they have already occurred. So in the past, with the forest in place, the forest was able to attend to this situation because they would absorb the water from the deep in the soil. But now these events are increasing in frequency and in severity. So the most important problem is the recharge of the aquifers that supply springs and rivers downstream, and all that is suffering the impacts. Also on top with the forest fires, the forests in the headwaters are suffering, and they are more and more being totally cut. So the expansion of the agricultural frontier, roads, buildings and cities aggravate all these conditions. And some of the information that they give us here is that the water levels of the Paraná River have decreased about 27%. This is from these reports. In the last month, just in December of this past year, the water flow was about 7,000 cubic meters per second. That doesn't tell you much, but that's 50% of the last 25-year average. So that's very dramatic, leading to shortages of water and hydroelectric power in places that depend from that. And overall, the Paraná River that I showed you at the beginning, had such a beautiful river, is currently at its lowest level in almost 80 years. So that's really outstanding. And look at what happened to the Iguazu waterfalls. On the left, you see the normal river level. On the right, the drought of 1978, how it resulted in this. But in the past, this was in 1978, these events were more rare, and the forest had the capacity, had some resiliency, and they were able to recover. But if it were not for the anthropic action of cutting forests and burning, the change of land use, the landscapes then would be more resilient, able to withstand the drought conditions caused by greenhouse gases and the unusual weather events that have to do with La Niña in this particular year. As part of our projects then with the School of Forest Science of the University of Misiones, we are working with farmers implementing agroforestry systems with subsistence and cash crops, along with restoration techniques for forests, water protection, with collaborators in other tropical countries as well, not just Misiones in Argentina. The program in tropical forestry and agroforestry from Yale, from our school, conducts research on topics such as ecosystem and landscape restoration in general, reforestation with native species, biodiversity recovery and conservation, conservation of non-timber forest products, traditional and more modern agroforestry systems, organic agroforestry. This is in contrast to this is conventional agroforestry with yerba mate. Look at the soil, bare soil, but we're studying and trying to promote organic agroforestry as an example. A conservation of genetic diversity, biodiversity islands of resiliency, as I mentioned to you before. These are collaborators from CIPAP from Colombia, These are intensive silvopastoral systems that are part of restoration techniques as well. Some examples of the Yale program in tropical forestry and agroforestry projects were in Latin America. Here we're in Mexico, 3 places in Central America, Ecuador, Santa Fe in Argentina, Misiones in Argentina, Bahia in Brazil. So conservation of native trees, yerba mate, agroforestry, islands of resiliency. This is a bigger picture of the islands of resiliency. These islands that were left in the middle of these monocultures, we're now trying to improve them, plant more native species and make them be part of agroforestry systems that can serve local needs and local markets. In Brazil, in the Mata Atlântica, as you see here, forest restoration is the agroforestry systems here too, in the Mata Atlântica in Bahia. In Costa Rica, organic coffee. We have an experiment about 20 years old. In Ecuador, in the Chocó region here, alternatives for supplying needs to local farmers so they don't intrude into the reserves, and other projects too much to mention. And to close, I want to show you something that I hope it's inspiring to you. This is a book that I'm reading. A friend of mine gave it to me recently for Christmas, and when I opened, I said, oh, it's a great book, The Soil and Health, a study for organic agriculture, by, imagine this, Sir Albert Howard, honorary fellow of the Imperial College of Science, etc., etc. So a British scientist who was smart enough back then. So this book was published in 1947. Look at how far back this goes. And he was, and look at this vignette here, this drawing. He went to India, at the time a colony of the US and of the UK, and he examined the land uses by indigenous people from India and wrote this book. And in this book, it's wonderful how he describes the techniques and how they should be adapted. And you see the whole principle, the soil and health. What he's saying is that if the soil is treated the way it should be treated, with organic techniques and recycling, etc., it leads to a healthy soil, a healthy crops, and healthy people. And this is very relevant to us that we are in the middle of the pandemic, and who knows what other diseases we're going to face in the future. So coming back to your conference concept note, you are saying that in the decade of ecosystem restoration and engage in responding to an urgent call to action to curb and reverse ecosystem degradation, restoration efforts need to be scaled up. That's a real challenge. But the successful long-lasting restoration often depends on local factors. So these complex local issues of degradation vary hugely across temporal and spatial scales. So what we need is something that I think a book like this one, or there are so many books. I'm also reading this one that was recommended by one of my former students, Ishmael, that tells you how to change your mentality. And I'm also reading another book by Ursula Le Guin, who was actually one of those pioneer feminists in the US, and he wrote an incredibly beautiful book. It's called The Name of the World is Forest. So it's absolutely beautiful book. So there are many inspiring things. So we have all this inspiration, basic scientific knowledge, like the one depicted here, the soil and health, on sustainable use of land leading to whole ecosystem health. All this is long dated. What we need to do is adapt this knowledge to current realities, communicate and disseminate results and strategies to put them into action. So I'm really convinced that conferences like this one can greatly contribute to achieving this goal by communicating with practitioners, scientists, and just to close, then many thanks for your attention. This is my latest book. It's coming up in March, Biodiversity Islands, Strategies for Conservation in Human-Dominated Environments. If any of you want to contact me for giving you more information about anything I said, or books, or whatever else. And these are some of our colleagues and friends, Beatriz Eibel from Misiones. This is a conference, Brett Levin from our school, who passed me that book that I showed to you. Patricia and Fernando, also from Misiones. Several conferences, this is the message, conferences like this one. This was a UFRO conference in Misiones in Argentina in 2018, when we could still go in person to conferences. This Silvopastoral Systems Conference. This is one of our youngest collaborators. At the time, he was 19. So it's another conference. Many of these people are participating in that book that I told you, including this one here. And this is from an ISTF conference, actually. Ruth Metzel, Alicia Calle, Bob Bushbacker, another author of the book. So conferences like this can really make an impact. So I'm really happy to be able to open this conference for you, and wish you the best of luck and enjoy the conference. Thank you so much for listening.
Thank you so much, Florencia, for your remarks. I'm now going to pass the floor to my fellow co-chair, Ryan Smith, who's going to be moderating our opening keynote.
Thank you so much, Florencia. That was a really fascinating and wonderful way to open up the session. For the next 50 minutes, our keynote, John Parrotta, will be speaking, and afterwards we'll have about 10 minutes to address questions from the audience. As a reminder, this session is recorded and will be shared on YouTube channel. We encourage you to ask questions for John as they arise. You can do so by typing them into the chat box. There will also be a chance to raise your hand and ask questions at the end. Whether you ask questions in the chat verbally, we ask that you provide your name and affiliation. In the chat, you can additionally indicate whether you would like to ask the question yourself, or the moderator can ask on your behalf. Now, we'll turn to John Parrotta to hear our opening keynote address. John Parrotta is currently serving as the president of the International Union of Forest Research Organizations in a term from 2019 to 2024. He began his career as a research scientist with the USD Forest Service in 1991 and has served as National Research Program Leader for International Science Issues since 2001. He provides scientific and technical advice for development of science-based policy positions in international forestry policy forums. He works with government agencies, international organizations, and other partners to strengthen global forest science, biodiversity conservation, and sustainable forest management. John holds a PhD from Yale University and has been engaged in research worldwide for over 30 years, with a focus on tropical forest ecology and management, traditional knowledge, and forest landscape restoration. He is author of a number of books and over 180 other research publications, and serves as an editorial board member for several international scientific journals. John, we're delighted to have you with us. The floor is yours.
Sorry about that. Yeah, thanks, Ryan, for that introduction. And I'd also like to thank the whole team at the Yale School of Environment for organizing this year's incarnation of the ISTF annual ISTF conference. The program looks really excellent with a range of highly relevant topics and distinguished speakers who I'm sure are going to be just wonderful to listen to and to discuss important issues with. I'd particularly like to thank Emma Grover, Claudia Ochoa, and Yvonne Shi for all their facilitation of my participation in this event. When I was invited back in December, it didn't take me long to accept the invitation for many reasons. One is this topic is sort of central to my research career, my professional career. Secondly, it's Yale. It's where I began my work in the area. And third, it's just a great opportunity to interact with so many colleagues and students and practitioners from around the world. My interest in this topic began about 40 years ago, actually. And my background is more as an ecologist. So I come from the biophysical side of things. And my PhD work at Yale involved analyses of how planted forests can help restore favorable soil conditions for just redevelopment of natural ecosystems, in particular and how they interact with wildlife to actually accelerate natural regeneration in degraded areas. Over the years, through various projects and responsibilities that I've had, my perspective on this has broadened quite a bit, and I can see how important it is not just to gather the best available ecology and silvicultural knowledge and expertise, but to also actively involve and use the tremendous knowledge that exists in the social sciences to tackle a problem as complex and fundamentally interdisciplinary as forest landscape restoration. So this topic, because it's so multifaceted, it encourages all of us to kind of get out of our disciplinary silos and work together. I think it's a very rewarding prospect for all of us. I can just share my screen. Let me see. Where can I find my screen? There we go. Okay. Okay, I have to, excuse me for the technical incompetence here. Here we go. Okay, so thanks. But before I begin, I would like to pay homage to a couple of individuals who have made enormous contributions to the field of forestry and conservation and education, all in one. These two dear colleagues and friends of many of ours around the world both passed away in the last month. The first of them is Dr. Frank Wadsworth, who, yes, those dates are correct. He lived to the ripe old age of 106. And for most of, he grew up in Chicago, was educated at the University of Michigan, doing work in Alaska. And he first began work with the US Forest Service in Arizona. And soon after that, in the early 40s, he moved to Puerto Rico, where he made his home for the subsequent, do the math, 80 years. Frank is well known, of course, in Puerto Rico and the Caribbean region, but also throughout Latin America and indeed the world, for his outstanding work in the field of tropical forest management. He's a tremendous scientist, but beyond that, he's someone who's always deeply concerned with how forests can serve people. And he spent a lot of his energy throughout his life engaged in conservation education activities, and particularly working with youth groups. Again, he was a giant in that field, and someone who was, I think, a mentor to just hundreds and hundreds of people from around the world, and who will always be remembered as a champion of tropical forest conservation and sustainable management. The other colleague who we sadly lost was Professor Jeff Burley. Jeff, like myself, was a PhD, got his PhD from Yale University a little bit earlier in the early 60s. He was a forest geneticist. Jeff is from England, and soon after finishing his PhD, he began his international research and development work in Southern Africa, a number of countries in Southern Africa, before returning to the UK in the late 60s, around 1970. And for most of the rest of his career, he was based at Oxford University, where he was a much loved professor to generations of tropical foresters. Among his many contributions was his ability to bring together diverse interests in the cause of sustainable forest management and for the benefits of people depending on forests. He he was a past president of UFRO and served in a number of other capacities in international or professional organizations. So Jeff is another person who we remember with much gratitude, and we stand on their shoulders. Those we've learned from. So now, getting into the topic of my discussion, what I intend to do this morning is just give more of a broader picture of the role of forest landscape restoration and how it can accomplish a number of important goals. And what I would like to do is focus primarily on giving a general overview of the current situation with respect to forest loss and degradation, how we got here, and a little bit of discussion on the way forward through forest landscape restoration initiatives. Many of you may recognize this figure. This is from the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment. This is a really superb way to illustrate the benefits that forests provide to people. I'm not going to go through all of the details, but I think many of you have all seen this, and there's so many diverse links between the functions of forests, or the structure and composition of forests, what they provide to people, and their other production systems outside of forests, as well as the cultural, educational, and spiritual benefits that forests provide to people. And on the right side of that figure is actually what the ultimate contributions are to human well-being. Point that I'd like to make regarding this one is, of all of the services that forests provide, people value them in different ways, and this is really an important point in the area of forest landscape restoration. I mean, for some, the provision of water or directly for forest foods might be paramount in their considerations. For others, it may be it could be educational or spiritual, cultural values. So the different values that people, the different values that forests hold for people determine what their motivations may or may not be when engaging in forest landscape restoration programs or initiatives. So where are we with the current situation with respect to forests? Yeah, so today we have roughly 1.5 billion hectares of forests in various states of intactness or not. About 500 million hectares are considered to be in pretty good shape in terms of their structure, their biodiversity, and their ecological functions, as well as provision of goods and services to people. Another approximately 1 billion hectares are in some form of what might be called a degraded state. Either they're production forests that aren't being managed fully sustainably, or they've been opened up, and these would include the secondary forests, or they're in maybe more intensively managed conditions, as in planted forests and agroforestry systems, which of course provide enormous benefits to people. So we have a whole range of forest conditions to be considering in our work, plus the hundreds of millions of hectares of formerly forested lands that are degraded. They are not providing much by way of services to people, and in fact, they're providing a lot of disservices and having severe environmental, economic, and social consequences for people. And these of course, become prime targets for our efforts in forest landscape restoration. As we move down the spectrum from intact forests to secondary disturbed forests, intensively managed forests to more degraded landscapes. When it comes to restoration efforts, as we move along this spectrum, the difficulty, complexity, the time, and the costs of restoration, of course, increase, as does, however, the costs of inaction. So they're a priority, but they will take resources and our best science and our best organizational skills and our best governance as well. I think it goes without saying that that it's a lot easier. I mean, it's a lot more effective to prevent a problem than to try to fix it. So in the context of what we're talking about today, avoiding deforestation, avoiding degradation should be paramount in the minds of policymakers and indeed all of us. You know, there's a lot of work to be done both for avoiding deforestation and degradation. There are improvements to be made in our production systems that will minimize degradation, and of course, we'll in the final stage, when necessary and very strategically, it's a priority to reverse this degradation through restoration activities. Just like to show a couple of maps here. The one on the top is probably very familiar to everyone. Oops, I'm sorry. Yeah, that's the current forest area in the world. As you can see, I don't need to explain this. It's also shrinking in some respects in certain parts of the world, particularly in China and India and a few other places. Forest area has actually been increasing in recent years, but it's mainly due to massive forest plantation efforts. What is maybe perhaps less known and less appreciated by foresters and restoration practitioners, or ecologists in particular, is the other problems that are kind of driving this whole, that's really driving what we're seeing in forests, and that's land degradation. Of course, this is the focus of the third Rio Convention, the UN Convention to combat desertification. And the map on the bottom actually illustrates the extent of soil degradation in the world as measured by, or more specifically, it's a map showing erosion worldwide. And this is actually really important for us to be considering. It may not be directly impacting forested lands, but it is impacting agricultural lands in many parts of the world, and very severely. And of course, the degradation of agricultural lands, and this includes croplands and grazing lands, eventually is putting pressure on forests in a variety of ways, and I'll get to that in a moment. So I think as much as we are concerned about forests, we should also be concerned about the condition and the trends in the surrounding landscapes, particularly the agricultural landscapes. And of course, overlying all of this is climate change and its impacts. It's exacerbating these problems of soil erosion through increased frequency of drought and extreme weather events in many parts of most parts of the world at this point. It's also having severe implications for forests as well, with increased frequency of fire and severe storms, and increased incidence of pests and diseases. So we really need to take a whole landscape view of this problem of forest degradation, and be very conscious and work with those who are more involved in the fields of agriculture, for example. And well, over the decades, in the last, forest science has been around for a very long time, but in the last 50 years, I'd say, there's been increased emphasis on a number of topics and issues that are relevant to our work in forest landscape restoration. Initially, a lot of this work was, I think, driven by forest scientists and by ecologists. But as the prominence of the issue of land degradation and forest degradation in particular became more pronounced and more more in the public eye, we've also seen a larger number of social scientists and professionals from other disciplines focusing their attentions on these issues of forest degradation and restoration. So our knowledge base is actually very, very good. And in the last 5 to 10 years, actually the last 5 years in particular, there have been a number of excellent multidisciplinary syntheses that have been produced, scientific syntheses that have been produced to inform, in particular, policymakers at the global level, as well as national level audiences, including a number of very, very good practitioners' guides or just guidelines for forest landscape restoration, which also you make use of this knowledge in all fields. So there's a lot of very, very good information out there, a lot of good science that's been synthesized and translated for many different kinds of audiences. So I think we have the basic tools we need to do good work in this area. So coming out of all of that work, this is just an indicative list because these could be both columns of this table could be extremely long. We have a pretty good understanding of what the direct and indirect drivers of forest landscape degradation are. The direct drivers include forest conversion for agricultural use. It's probably the prime driver worldwide. In some regions, infrastructure development is a big driver, as is mining and urbanization. More pervasively, over larger areas, is the unsustainable management of forests, as well as pastoral and croplands, which is severely undermining the integrity of forests in many regions. As I mentioned before, climate change is having direct impacts on forests and lands in general through increased droughts, fires, pests and diseases, and biological invasions, invasive species, having pretty significant impacts on many forest ecosystems, particularly montane ecosystems, dryland forest ecosystems, and in many islands. Behind these direct drivers are some underlying or external factors that are pushing people to do things that that aren't in their best interest, and they usually know if they're not in their best interest. And these underlying or indirect drivers must be kept in consideration when thinking about developing and implementing a forest landscape restoration program. There's also, I'm not going to go through all of them, but there's things there are factors that are demographic nature, population pressure, due to climate change, as well as armed conflict. We see large numbers of people migrating both within countries and between countries, which is also having severe impacts on forests due to poverty, and there's also a very high reliance on forest goods in some communities. There's underlying social dynamics that marginalize some segments of society, and these are often those who depend most strongly on forests and the services they provide. There's a whole other host of underlying factors that one really needs to consider, not least of which those that involved some of us who think we live far from the problems, and that has to do with market and consumer demands for unsustainably produced forest and agricultural products, minerals, fossil fuels. If we weren't so enamored of our cell phones, we probably wouldn't have the kind of mining disasters that we see worldwide that are typically taking place in forested areas. As one example, we should be paying attention to where our food comes from, for example. But that's a topic for another lecture, probably by somebody who's more qualified to speak about it than I am. So, well, the good news is that, as we know, the interest among governments and international organizations has been increasing in this area of ecosystem restoration and forest restoration specifically. We're now in the UN decade on ecosystem restoration. In the last 5 to 10 years, some other major initiatives have been launched. The Global Partnership on Forest and Landscape Restoration has been critical in the building of support among governments and international organizations and NGOs in forest landscape restoration. So there's a very strong awareness that we have a big problem, but it's also a problem that, if solved, can also help address a number of other social and environmental challenges that we have as outlined in the Sustainable Development Goals. One can see, when one thinks about it a little bit, I think at least half of the SDGs have some very direct linkages and implications for forests. So that was the good news. There's a lot of attention. We have a lot of knowledge. We have a lot of expertise. We have a high energy at the moment in governments and international organizations to take action. We have some very good programs already underway. The bad news is that the attention span of policymakers and governments is not as long as we would like it to be, and that it needs to be for efforts that really take long-term commitment, like forest landscape restoration. I don't need to point out the kinds of challenges that we're dealing with these days, but the fact is, we cannot count on a long-term support, either political support or financial support for forest landscape restorations. So it's incumbent on us to really apply ourselves, our best knowledge and our expertise to collaborate in doing the best we can in the window that we have available, and hope that with a lot of good results, these efforts will be self-sustaining, even if attention begins to shift elsewhere. Hopefully most of you are familiar with this general schematic of forest landscape restoration. This concept has been around for about 20 years now, and there have been projects that have utilized this approach for about as long as it's been around. But it's defined in various ways. But I think of it as it's a planned process that aims at restoring both ecological integrity and functionality, as well as enhancing human well-being across all components of deforested and degraded forest landscapes. So it's got both the social as well as ecological, social, economic, and environmental ecological objectives. There's many stages for this and variations on this, but what it does require is a lot of consultation among the most important stakeholders on a landscape. It requires a lot of knowledge, upfront knowledge about the landscape itself, about how it's being used, and what the forces are that that are affecting its use. And it's a long process of developing common understanding of problems that can be addressed through some sort of management intervention. It requires the development of a shared vision, a lot of collaboration in implementing specific management interventions, and very importantly, it requires a fairly regular monitoring of results and reassessment of objectives as results become apparent, and perhaps as objectives change among the stakeholders. So it's an iterative process, and it's well, in the forest world, we consider that to be adaptive management. And as I said, it's a long-term commitment, and it's fundamentally a social process. You know, the scientific knowledge, traditional knowledge, all sorts of skills and expertise can be applied to it, but it's fundamentally about people, and it's about people and reconciling interests, needs and interests and aspirations of diverse subsets of communities in a landscape. As I noted earlier, it is extremely important to understand the history of the landscape one is dealing with. It's how it got to the condition it is. You know, why and where degradation is taking place. What are the biophysical characteristics in terms of biodiversity, in terms of soil loss, in terms of these kinds of things, as well as what are the socio-ecological characteristics of the landscape. Who's using the land, for what purpose, what are their needs, and so on. So it's a need to understand the past conditions, the present, the past forces that have led to the current landscape one sees before us, the present dynamics within that landscape, and some sense of where things are going in terms of the communities involved. It's a little bit difficult to predict the future, but that's, you need to have some kind of visioning exercise involved in FLR. So again, I just alluded to some of this. Part of this assessment process that precedes, really is the starting point for an FLR project development, is the assessment of the services that people derive from forest lands by various stakeholder groups. And these, again, may be very different. I mean, there may be people who are more directly dependent on forest goods and services than others. And the other part of this, another part of this assessment has to be, which is very important, is an evaluation of existing governance institutions, power relations among groups within these communities, patterns of forest ownership and control, land use and forest use rights. Another aspect is some kind of assessment of the of resource availability in terms of human resources, local knowledge, external resources that can be brought to bear, as well as mentioned earlier, environmental, demographic, social, economic, and political trends. So all of these things need to be considered. It's not a simple task. So ultimately, the kinds of interventions that are used in forest landscape restoration programs involve a variety, a whole menu of land rehabilitation and ecosystem restoration practices. These could be both, within forest areas, or very importantly, outside of forest areas, measures intended to, for example, reduce erosion in surrounding in areas surrounding agricultural areas, and as well as other important interventions that have been applied, have been focused on improving agricultural productivity. And these involve agroforestry techniques, application of agroecology practices, and a number of other practices in the agricultural area. I mean, just as important, if not more important in some instances, are interventions that involve implementation of appropriate institutional, economic, and political mechanisms, such as improving access to markets, and creating markets in some cases for sustainably produced agricultural or forest products. There's often an emphasis on diversification of rural economies, so that people are less dependent on practices that degrade forests and other ecosystems. Other tools that have been used are payment for ecosystem services, clarification of land ownership and use rights, plus things that are very important especially for farmers, are access to credit and training and insurance, crop insurance. And these are aspects that really do need to be considered in these programs. And finally, the whole suite of interventions or techniques that can be used that involve that aim to enhance collaboration and knowledge exchange between land management, research and policy communities, and may involve participatory approaches in research, and certainly involve the use of integration of traditional knowledge into land management interventions. I'd like to spend just a few minutes talking about, or just giving you an overview of some of the things that UFRO has been involved in forest landscape restoration. This is an area of actually high priority for us. We've been members of the Global Partnership for Forest Landscape Restoration since that partnership began. And even before that, we've had a number of, one of our priority areas is to synthesize scientific knowledge at the global level, and develop training programs for scientists, practitioners, and other stakeholders. And over the years, we've done this kind of work in a number of different fields, but in the last 10 to 15 years, it's been largely focused on forest landscape restoration. This is done through UFRO's special program for development of capacities, which has been in existence for almost 40 years now. We draw on the expertise that exists in our member organizations worldwide, in our permanent research groups, including the one on restoration of degraded sites, which is actually one that I initiated back in the early 90s. And we have a task force that looks at both climate change adaptation as well as landscape restoration, and that's been going on since 2015. Among the projects that the UFRO's been developing through the years, I've kind of listed them here, but there's one that I did want to just bring your attention to and say a few words about. This is the Forest Landscape Restoration Scientific Snapshot Analysis Project. And this was initiated about 5 years ago, with the objective of conducting independent scientific evaluation of existing forest landscape restoration projects. The idea here was to come in with interdisciplinary teams of people drawn from from the specific countries to look at how ongoing forest landscape restoration projects are going from an environmental, social, and economic point of view, as well as looking at basically to provide independent analysis, as well as try to extract some lessons learned and formulate this into usable advice for project managers as well as policymakers in the countries involved. And so this project went on for a few years and looked at 17 landscapes in 9 different countries, 3 each in Africa, Asia, and Latin America. And the methodology was a very systematic methodology that was used within each of the landscapes. It involved quite comprehensive, semi-structured interviews of a very broad array of stakeholders who were involved in these projects, whether they were people who lived on the project, in the project areas, all the way up to sort of national level stakeholders. And out of this came a number of very interesting individual project reports that were shared with, of course, with everyone involved, as well, and the combination of all these case studies led to development of certain. There was some analysis of all the results of those, and some kind of common threads that emerged by way of lessons. Again, these were all the different locations, listing the countries, and they were all different kinds of situations and landscape situations and challenges, ranging from those that focused very strongly on forest biodiversity conservation, to those whose primary focus was on agricultural enhancement of agricultural productivity. All of these things having implications for forests. So it was quite an extensive set of out of which emerged some overall. And down those, a lot of these look very familiar. But these are actually common elements that determined principal lessons that pointed to the factors that either facilitate success or impede it in forest landscape restoration initiatives. Again, I don't need to go through all of the details here, but I would very strongly encourage those who may be interested in this to have a look at the sort of the final report from this and some of the detailed case study analyses. And there's a website down below. It's on the UFRO webpage. I'm happy to actually provide more detailed information to anyone who wishes. Just let me know. So just a few concluding remarks to wrap up. I'm glad we're going to have a little bit of time for some discussion. So a couple take-home messages that obviously both halting and reversing forest loss it's a very complicated and multifaceted challenge, and the solutions have to be tailored to local conditions and needs. Collaboration among scientific disciplines, as well as with local stakeholders, is absolutely essential for understanding the context in which forest landscape restoration is to be conducted. Without supportive policy institutions at all levels, as well as necessary financial resources and capacity building, it's very likely that efforts will either be that the success of FLR initiatives will either be short-lived or never get off the ground. And finally, we all have a stake in this in terms of understanding, where where the resources we use every day come from, how they're produced, where money is invested. These are all very important indirect drivers of forest landscape restoration, forest landscape degradation. So we should be cognizant of our responsibility and the opportunities we have to actually make a positive difference. So with that, thank you for your attention, and I would welcome any comments or questions.
Thank you so much, John. That was a wonderful opening to our conference and overview for all of us on kind of the state of forest landscape restoration and why it's needed. So we've got about a little over 10 minutes for some questions and answers, and you can keep putting them in the chat. I'm going to start off one. You mentioned that restoration is primarily, or I think you said it was fundamentally a social project. And I was wondering, is this a new idea? And how has our understanding of restoration changed over time, particularly in the last 10 years?
Yeah, no, it's a good question. And I think all of the social scientists and social ecologists and others in the audience will say a response to that is, duh, of course it's a social process. All land management is primarily a social question. Yeah, I mean, what I meant by that was, well, backing up a little bit, those of us who started out from the biophysical side of things, we think of, we've been so focused on getting the silviculture right, getting the ecology right, that I'm talking about myself actually, it didn't really pay close enough attention to what was going on around the forest. And I think that's maybe a general problem in forestry, is people tend to just kind of not want to look outside the forest. But when it comes to forest landscape restoration, which involves multiple stakeholders, unlike kind of the earlier incarnations of forest restoration, which typically would, or more often involved, limited land areas under the management or ownership of of a small number of entities. This is complicated, and this involves multiple land uses, multiple interests. So it's a negotiation. I'm not sure if that answers the question, but
yeah, it does. Thank you. And then I have another question coming in, specifically asking about soil erosion, and they were asking, so soil erosion is also part of nutrient transfer across landscapes, and how does a restoration practitioner decide how much erosion is okay?
Well, when it's creating gullies through forests and on into agricultural lands, I'd say enough is enough. I mean, I think it's in general, I think we do want to control erosion in general. I don't really see a great advantage to accelerating wind or water erosion in landscapes.
Yeah, great, thanks. And then we have a question from Edgardo Gonzalez, and he was wondering, can you discuss some additional ideas that promote stronger involvement and collaboration, which move forest restoration policy discussions at a country level? Sometimes agricultural activities move in one direction and forest restoration in another direction without meeting in common places. And so can you discuss how collaboration can be useful for policy discussions between agricultural and forestry departments in a country?
Yeah, no, thanks for that, Edgardo. Yeah, this is that's super important. I mean, part of our problem is the stovepipe problem with policy development. We have certain agencies responsible for forests. It might be a forest department, or it could be part of an environment ministry. and we have agriculture in somewhere else, and each one is making their own policies, and there's this lack of coordination is not helpful. Not only, it's not just the land management ministries, whether it's forestry or agriculture, it's the finance ministries, it's the ministries responsible for mining, for all of those indirect drivers of forest landscape degradation. So yeah, so there's a fundamental challenge in most countries to get ministries to have these discussions at the interministerial level. It's a common problem. It's not limited to any particular part of the world. It's certainly a problem in my own country. But I think one way that depends on where we are in the where our professional lives exist. But I think for those of us at either academic or professional level, I think we can and should be talking to our colleagues in the other fields. I think there's a startling lack of collaboration between agricultural scientists and foresters. And that's one thing that many of us, it's within our power to have more collaboration with people in agriculture. But I think the way to get there are many good ways to try to catalyze greater discussion among policymakers, and one of those is probably to is through public education, get the public clamoring for solutions. So part of our job is also education and increasing public awareness.
Great, thank you. Now we have a question coming in from Greg Smith, who's an artist and a member of a land trust, and he was wondering, success factors and barriers to restoration are very complex. So what do you feel is the most significant barrier to success at both a local scale and then at a global scale? And then I would add, are there different barriers to success at different scales?
Yes, the answer is yes. That's a really complicated question. The barriers to success of the, I mean, I would look to those drivers and those indirect drivers in particular, and see where power relations, for example, within a community are preventing any meaningful involvement of any meaningful change of behavior among some stakeholders that they're perhaps causing the most damage, and limiting access to those that have it within that depend most strongly on forest resources. I mean, I'd look at those indirect drivers and see if those are being addressed.
Yeah, that's a really great answer. That actually reminds me of our upcoming panel, which is on political ecology, which is going to be looking at those types of power relations at a larger scale, although that can also be applied to a local scale within a community even. Next, we have a question that's from Akshay Surendra, and Akshay was wondering, do you think that slash and burn agriculture is compatible with restoration? And do you see a middle path there?
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, another area that I've worked in quite a bit is broadly traditional forest knowledge. And shifting cultivation has been for probably tens of thousands of years. The basis has been the mode of agricultural production in the world, in all parts of the world. But traditional shifting cultivation is based on very intimate and detailed and sophisticated knowledge of forest ecology and and how forests can be manipulated for agricultural purposes and still retain their productive capacity. I mean, the problem with traditional shifting, what's happened to traditional shifting cultivation in recent decades, over the last 100 years in particular, are a couple of things. One is that shifting cultivators worldwide have been very strongly discouraged from practicing their agricultural, their from practicing it, either forced to settle or just forest departments have been the enemy of shifting cultivators for at least 100 years. The other problem, even where shifting cultivation continues, is difficulties in following the known sustainable practices, which involve perhaps longer rotations between or shorter cropping periods instead of maybe 3 years cropping for 2 to 3 years. When it gets extended out a couple more years, and or people returning to the same place again too soon. So these end up reducing, resulting in deterioration of soils and biodiversity in these landscapes. So it's a combination of external prohibitions on the practice plus internal limitations on the ability to practice sustainably that make it a problem. But in their original forms, traditional shifting cultivation is actually a highly sustainable practice.
Great, thank you. We've got a bunch of questions coming in now. We've got maybe time for one, maybe two more short answers. So we have a question from Thorhag Anitra. What do you think may be accomplished by the UN focus on ecosystem restoration, theoretically and practically, the potential for results in the next 10 years?
Yeah, I mean, have to see. I mean, for one thing, I think these UN declarations and decades and years, I mean, they're very good for public awareness. So sensitizing the general population about a problem or an issue that really deserves everyone's attention. And secondly, it does provide a focus for both for international collaboration, because when countries make these declarations and sign off on whether it's agreements or even just something like the UN decade on X, Y, or Z, it does seem to provide a nice framework for international collaboration. But again, one of my slides had this little graph about the attention span and enthusiasm gaps and so on. And the question is, for how long can that enthusiasm, that initiative, and that support for things be maintained?
Great. I'm gonna ask one more question here, and I'm gonna combine two into one. So Matthew was wondering, how can we get more young people involved in this space from backgrounds who might not be into forest science, but who are necessary for transdisciplinary solutions? What are the best pathways for engagement and collaboration? And then I'm going to add also a question from Sheila. So how can we get people to understand how restoration is hard work and requires really strong commitment, and can help them put together the work necessary for a decent funding, for a fundable proposal? So how can we get more diverse people involved, and how can we help them understand the challenges of forest restoration to get projects funded?
These are good questions. I'm not sure I have an answer for that, and I'm gonna pass on those and see if we can explore those in future sessions.
Yeah, well, that's a great segue. So,
it's a great way out, isn't
it? Yeah, well, we have 3 days of incredible programming for everybody. So many different speakers and panels. 2 more keynotes, 3 panels. Our next event is going to be a panel on political ecology and tropical forest restoration. We're going to be hosting speakers Minnie Degawan, Pamela McElwee, and Susan Chamba. It's going to be moderated from Eva Guerin. That's going to start. It's going to start at 11 and run until 12:30. Then after that, today, we're going to have a special announcement by Robin Chasson and Cora Van Oosten on the Global Capacity Gaps Knowledge and Learning Plan for the UN Decade on Restoration. And then 2:30 to 3:30, of course, these times are all Eastern Standard Time. 2:30 to 3:30, we're going to have 4 breakout sessions with opportunities for engagement with some excellent speakers. And then tomorrow, starting again at 9 o'clock, And also don't forget to tune in tomorrow for the Innovation Prize, in which we're going to hear pitches by 3 finalists who will be competing for our votes for some cash prizes that are going to be rewarding some innovative, meaningful action that's locally led on the ground in tropical countries. So we thank you all so much for attending. And then let me just put the link to the agenda in the chat for everyone's convenience. And then you should all also have it in your emails. Thank you, John and Florencia and Mariana, and to all of our conference organizers. And we look forward to continuing to interact with you all throughout the next 2 days. Oops.